Hey everyone, today we are looking into the lives of the Seven Sutherland Sisters, who over a century ago became famous for having extremely long hair, and have even been compared with Rapunzel. This is their story. The 7 women who would one day go on to become America's first hair celebrities were born to Fletcher and Mary Sutherland in Niagara County in upstate New York in the mid-19th century. Sarah, the eldest, was born in 1845 and was followed by Victoria 4 years later in 1849. The third eldest of the septet was Isabella. She was born in 1852, but there is some dispute down to this day, which has never been resolved, as to whether she was a biological sister of the other 6, or if she was adopted. After her came Grace in 1854, Naomi in 1858, and then Dora and Mary in 1860 and 1862 respectively. Thus, there was a significant 17-year age gap between the eldest of the 7 sisters, Sarah, and the youngest, Mary. The Sutherlands were not born into affluence. They lived a tough life in the rural landscape of Cambria, a small community in Niagara County. Their father, Fletcher, was a turkey farmer, but he was a lazy do-nothing who had his daughters carry out much of the work barefoot on their land. To make matters more difficult for them, their mother Mary was an eccentric woman who insisted that her daughters not cut their hair, and would make them use a foul-smelling ointment on it to allegedly make it grow thicker and longer. The elements of their future success were nevertheless laid down during this peculiar childhood. Mary Fletcher's insistence that her daughters grow their hair as long as possible would create the conditions for their fame, while Fletcher Sutherland, for all his laziness, had the tongue of a used car salesman, and at one point had even managed to find a job in the service of President James Buchanan. His ability to sell, and Mary's insistence on her daughters growing their hair out, would come together many years later to make celebrities of the Sutherland sisters. When they were still little, Fletcher Sutherland had begun training his daughters to play various musical instruments and soon had them singing in the local church choir. They might have remained a simple bunch of sisters singing in a choir in rural upstate New York, but as the years went by and multiple sisters began appearing with ever longer hair at their local church, more and more people began to show an interest in the singers for their follicle prowess, rather than their singing abilities. The sisters' mother Mary died in 1867, at which time the eldest Sarah was already in her early 20s, but young Mary was just 5 years old. The sisters no longer had to deal with the foul-smelling hair ointment she had imposed on them for years, but their father Fletcher was concocting a plan around this time. The snake oil merchant in Mr. Sutherland had seen how much interest his daughters' hair had generated, and so he began transforming the septet, along with their brother Charles, into a touring band, one which began playing at county fairs and community theatres around the state. At these, they were billed as the Concert of the 7 Sisters and 1 Brother. By the 1880s, the sisters, from whose act Poor Charles had now been dropped by this time, made their debut on Broadway in New York City. Building on this success, they went on a road tour of the southern states, visiting cities like Pensacola in Florida, Atlanta in Georgia, and New Orleans in Louisiana. However, as earlier back in Niagara County, the girls attracted their main audience not for their singing and playing abilities, but owing to their fulsome hair. By the early 1880s, the 7 sisters sported an awe-inspiring 37 foot of thick hair between them. Some were more prodigious than others. For instance, the oldest sister, Sarah, had just 3 foot of thick wavy hair. By way of contrast, the second eldest, Victoria, had an enormous 7 foot of hair, which when let down, as it always was when they were performing, trailed along the ground behind her. The youngest, Mary, had 6 foot long hair. Naomi often wore hers in a braid, which was a modest 4 foot long when tied like this, but stretched to 5.5 foot when unwound. Thus, the sisters' hair length was prodigious at this time, when having long, unburnished hair was the height of the Victorian era style in Britain and Gilded Age style in America. Writers like Charles Dickens and William Makepeace Thackeray describe their heroines in glowing terms for having long, lustrous locks. Now, Fletcher Sutherland was not content simply with having his daughters' hair generate increasing footfall at their shows and a huge cash windfall for him. He also wanted to profit in other ways. Thus, as his daughters began hitting the big time in New York and touring the country, he concocted a hair growing tonic, which he marketed as being the key to his daughters' miraculous hair length. The Seven Sutherland Sisters hair grower was effectively snake oil, made out of a mix of salt, magnesium, witch hazel, bay rum, and somewhat worryingly, hydrochloric acid. There was no science to this tonic whatsoever, but because the sisters' hair was all the rage, the tonic quickly began to sell in huge quantities. Thus, by the early 1880s, the Seven Sutherland Sisters were not just a massive hit on the stage, but their hair tonic was becoming a major seller across the eastern United States. Given the runaway success of the sisters and their act, agents and representatives of major circuses, shows and vaudeville acts soon came knocking. This was an age prior to television and moving pictures, when such acts were the primary form of popular entertainment. By the 1880s, none was as esteemed as the Barnum and Bailey circus, typically billed as the greatest show on earth. It was Barnum and Bailey who won the bidding war in the early 1880s to acquire the Seven Sutherland Sisters as an act in their show. At the Barnum and Bailey show, the sisters soon established themselves as a different kind of act. As cruel as it might seem today, in the late 19th century, these shows were often comprised of people who were regarded as freaks at the time, often for having medical conditions, like gigantism or dwarfism, which people did not have any scientific understanding of at the time. While people paid money to see acts like these at the show, they were shunned by society at large. But this was different for the sisters, as they were lionized by society and treated like celebrities. When they performed in New York, people would follow them down the street during the day, attempting to acquire locks of their hair. In tandem with this, Fletcher Sutherland was working with one of the organizers of the show, Harry Bailey, to start producing more hair tonics and mass marketing them. By the late 1880s, they were selling new concoctions, one claiming to reverse male pattern baldness. It was clearly a snake oil, as the baldness remains a problem nearly a century and a half later. But this didn't stop it from selling in huge quantities. Such was the belief in the ability of the sisters' hair tonics. By 1883, the Sutherland Sisters Corporation had been founded to begin marketing their hair products, while reviews were obtained from qualified chemists asserting that the hair tonics were indeed miracle hair growth serums. By the end of 1884, less than 2 years after it was established, the Sutherland Sisters Corporation had made $90,000 in sales, the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's money. By now, the sisters' fame was extensive in large parts of the United States, and the income generated from their participation in the Barnum and Bailey circus, along with their dues from the company, saw them begin to earn large incomes. Moreover, with the death of their father in 1888, this increased substantially, as Fletcher Sutherland had been siphoning a huge chunk of the money his daughters earned off into his own pockets. Moreover, the money generated by the company continued to increase, as the range of products grew to include combs, cosmetics, and other items related to hair and facial care. Once they came into direct ownership of the company, they also proved to be shrewd businesswomen, coming up with clever marketing slogans and appearing at packed-out beauty demonstrations on Fifth Avenue in New York and other busy shopping districts in American cities. By the 1890s, they even had company offices operating not just in American cities such as New York and Chicago, but also abroad in Cuba and Canada. By that time, millions of their bottles of their hair tonics had been sold, and over 25,000 dealers were distributing it in business mechanisms which would later be employed by more well-known sellers of cosmetics such as Elizabeth Arden in the 20th century. The sisters took full advantage of their newfound wealth, shopping lavishly and accumulating luxury homes. Many of them did not marry in order to retain control of their financial affairs, and instead lavished attention on pets, which were treated extravagantly, a precursor of many modern celebrities' obsession with their cats and dogs. Their public image expanded in tandem. By the 1890s, the sisters had attained a major celebrity as late 19th century hair celebrities, often appearing in publications such as Harper's, The New York Times, Time, and The New Yorker. Signed photos and other memorabilia of the sisters sold for large prices, while the sisters were offered huge sums of money for locks of their hair. One fan is believed to have offered Victoria Sutherland thousands of pounds to cut off all of her hair, a sum equivalent to hundreds of thousands of pounds today. By the late 1890s, the pressures of fame were beginning to show. Several of the sisters became increasingly obsessive about their privacy, and others became eccentric. In the mid-1890s, they built a lavish mansion back in their native Niagara County. It was a grand statement of their pretensions, effectively built like a princess's castle, replete with turrets and cupolas. Inside, crystal chandeliers and the most expensive wood decorated every room. Beds were imported from Europe, and even the servants' quarters were built on an impressive scale. A horse and carriage attendant on the house had horses whose shoes were made of gold. These lavish expenses would ultimately be the undoing of the sisters. In the early 1900s, fights were beginning between them over profits from the company. Many had begun using drugs such as opium and cocaine, which could be obtained at pharmacies at the time, and this was increasing their erratic behaviour. A major source of income dried up when they stopped appearing in the Barnum and Bailey show following the death of Victoria, the second eldest daughter. She was the second of the 7 to die, Naomi having died young in 1893. However, the real decline of the sisters and their company came in the 1910s, as fashions surrounding hair started to change. Short bobs became the fashion, and as the appeal of this look went mainstream, sales of the Sutherland Sisters hair tonics dried up. By the time the third eldest sister, Isabella, died in 1914, the family fortune was beginning to dry up fast. Then, when the eldest, Sarah, died in 1919, the remaining 3 sisters, Grace, Dora, and Mary, headed out to Los Angeles, hoping to profit from the growing celebrity culture out west. Sadly, Dora died in a car accident out there. In the 1920s, Mary and Grace tried to keep the crippled hair fertilizer business alive in an era which long locks were no longer esteemed. Destitute, they lived in an abandoned house. Eventually, the company went completely bust in 1936. Mary ended up psychologically unstable and was committed to Buffalo State Asylum in the mid-1930s, where she died in 1939. Grace died destitute in 1946 in her early 90s, largely penniless. Thus, the Sutherland sisters were not just one of the earliest examples of major American celebrity, but also of rags to riches and back to rags again. Thank you everyone for watching this video on the Sutherland sisters. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of their lives and their business down in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also leave them in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.